£1 million sounds like a lot of money when you've never seen £1 million before. Once you've seen £1 million, it's not a lot of money because you're going to have to go and get another job, or you're going to have to build an agency again.
Why do you think there's a tendency to think that the solution to everything is just hiring more people?
And then I think from a growth perspective, two things that I've seen being really important. One is,
what strategies have you seen work best for keeping, let's say, high value clients during scale phase or growth phase?
Yeah, good question. And I was born at the right time. I came into the digital world in the late 90s, launched an agency business, which we ended up exiting fully that business in 2020. Obviously very successful kind of exit process. We ended up 250, 60, 70, 80 people plus. The other thing, as I discovered personally, right, is you've also got to have purpose. So you can't just wander off into the sunset and go on holiday all the time. That leaves you pretty miserable. You've got to have a reason to get up in the morning.
Simon, it's a pleasure to have you for the second time in a row by the popular demands, as we've received quite a bit of positive feedback on the first conversation that we've had with you, and people openly requested to have another go at it. And to be honest, it was quite fun and interesting to obviously talk with you. And it's always been, for me personally, it's been always interesting to learn from you and from your experience. And I think we should definitely, as we agree, we should definitely take a second go at it. Obviously, for those who are not aware who you are, perhaps you can just do a brief intro of what you've done and what you're currently busy with.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me back on. I really enjoyed the conversation last time, and it's always a slightly interesting journey, isn't it, to kind of do those things and then wait for the feedback. So I'm pleased that it was positive. But look, for a little bit of background, I've been very lucky. I was born at the right time. I came into the digital world in the late 90s, which was pretty good timing. Couldn't do a lot about it. So, that was pure luck. But, built some sites, in the sort of early 2000s. They became a group of content affiliate sites, launched an agency business, which, again, very long story short, ended up selling to Interpublic, which is obviously very interesting business at the moment in the news. And we ended up exiting fully that business in 2020, obviously very successful kind of exit process. We ended up, 250, 60, 70, 80 people plus, very significant revenues. So, really, really positive kind of impact on the world, I think, through that. And then aside to that, I've been angel investing into SaaS, particularly since about 2015, helped found and build a sort of a VC fund in that space. And now increasingly spend my time really kind of working as a NED to, kind of interesting scale-ups in the B2B space, including agencies, but also in SaaS and, tech-enabled businesses and stuff as well. And, also I do quite a bit of work with private equity, sort of helping them understand what good looks like through due diligence and that kind of stuff. So, yeah, that's a bit of background.
Yeah, amazing. Last time we briefly talked about obviously systems, go to market, your experience selling the agency, and now obviously being involved in M&A as well. Since we spoke last time, I've also had a fair number of conversations with agency owners of different sizes, and recently we started engaging with agencies, with a sort of mid-sized agency, I would say, 5 mil plus. Those already have like some sort of a senior leadership structure in place. They already know what they're doing, but a lot of them still, just like, I'm sure you perfectly know that every single stage of growth requires some sort of new information. Like there's always something you don't know about. And one of the sort of the most common questions that I've been receiving about agency growth, especially when it comes to 5-10 million revenues, is structuring teams and structuring agencies in the right way so the growth is efficient. So I'm curious, in your experience, are there any foundational systems or processes, maybe principles or philosophies, do you believe are critical for agencies aiming to scale, let's say, from 5 mil plus to 10 mil and beyond?
Yeah, it's a good question. Interestingly, I did a webinar very recently on this kind of like agency structuring it and org design at different stages. Funnily enough, I've literally just shared it today on LinkedIn so people can find that. But I think that it is a very different challenge. I think you're right. The the truth of, the kind of the cliche that, what got you here won't necessarily get you there, is stands true at that level as it did do, on all of those before. There is a glass ceiling at probably 6 to 8 million, I would say, usually, from in an agency perspective. And a lot of that is down to, the kind of the process of scaling more generally, which is, this thing that you start with generalists, you hire specialists, and then the specialist lead. And you're kind of obviously into that specialist leadership piece by that stage. You have formed a type of senior team, but that's an ever evolving feast, I think. And, I always talk about the requirement for 3 generals, and those generals, the requirement for those generals to become more experienced becomes greater and greater at this kind of level. So somebody in finance, somebody in ops, and somebody across commercial. And then making sure that, but those 3 people are the, your kind of the triage of, all problems and solutions, basically. And, you need to start to get past this kind of stage that you're talking about. You need really strong leaders in those places that have perhaps done the next stage. So it's no good kind of like relying necessarily on the people who've got you to there. As
Mm.
difficult that is sometimes, you need people that have also been to the next place. So you start to have to hire, a slightly more, I don't know if it's corporate, but, certainly a more experienced kind of leadership team. And that often will mean moving from having an operations director to a chief operating officer, for instance. Those kind of
Mm.
moves become important at this stage. So you're bringing another level of experience into the team. And then I think from a growth perspective, 2 things that I've seen being really important. One is forming a really commercially focused client service function and having that sit under your chief commercial officer. Really important. So actually moving the fundamental belief that account management is about doing great stuff for clients and, delivering on time and keeping them happy, to one where it's much more kind of consultative and, like
Mm.
senior in its kind of relationship approach to look for solving their problems. So you're a true kind of consultative partner.
Right. Is it more like a strategic role where the person who executes, let's say, advises the clients on the strategy, or how whatever the service that's being provided is embedded within the client's overarching or like long-term goals?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it was really about, like really almost taking like a consultative approach. So it's like,
Right.
you're going in as a consultant, not just to deliver what we're delivering now. That's just the start. It's to truly understand the organization, what it's trying to achieve, and
Yeah.
unlock the solutions to those things. And obviously, in the process of doing that, you can sell them more products and services. And that
Right.
is the big thing. I think if we look at the trajectory that we went on, for instance, we went from, we were doing about 10 million when we were acquired, and we kind of basically more than doubled that through our earn-out period. And the majority of that growth came from upsell cross-sell. So
Mm.
we ended up launching more products and services and teams around those different things, because it was led by the strategy of, well, actually the client services function is doing a really good consultative job now. They're coming to us with client problems that we need to figure out how we can solve.
Right. Is that strategic sort of consultative role becomes a part of the deliverables, or how do you structure the delivery of the consultancy itself? Is it sort of already a prerequisite for deliverables in the first place, or do you charge for consultancy separately?
No, I mean, I think, when you're doing your pricing and scoping piece, you obviously
Mm.
make sure that you are allowing enough time to do account management well, because
Right.
good account management should be that, right? You're not there to just go, right, well, you want X, Y, Z service from us, we will deliver that really well. Your job is to say, fundamentally understand why they want that service and what they're trying to achieve on a broader basis, land and
Mm.
expand into that business, and, farm it as well as you possibly can. And there's an element there of, like, free work, for want of a better description. And we would often do, sort of a lot of kind of free strategic audits. And, I talk to, the businesses that I sit on the board of and can, growth consult for, right, to do a lot of that is to kind of look for opportunities to present new solutions to them. And if that means that you have to take a hit in the short term for the longer term opportunity, then that's so be it.
Right. Right. And you mentioned about obviously going and hiring, recruiting senior leadership who've already been where you're at, and they've successfully maybe taken the next few steps. How does a CEO, like founder of an agency, go about going recruiting senior leadership? Where do they find them, especially when it comes to the strategic role or consultative role? Where does one go? Do you go and poach from other people from other agencies? Do you go you start working with a recruiter and help you sort of create a strategy around it? How did you do it?
Yeah, so I mean, interestingly, we kind of actually ran a lot of recruitment in house in the end. So we actually had an internal recruiter. But I think at that level, you are looking for headhunters, right? I think that's the key, is because you need people that have been on that specific journey or as close to that specific journey as possible, because there's huge value in that. And obviously, you're probably thinking about not just offering good salary and benefits, but they're going to expect options, a slice of the pie as well. So you need to think about the overall pot of how you attract those kind of people. And then as a
Mm,
CEO, your job is to sell them the vision. What
yeah.
is it that we're trying to build here? Are you up for that as well? Can you get excited about that? Because I can incentivize you to help us get there, but we all need to be really aligned. It's more of a partner kind of conversation than it is an employee conversation almost.
Right. So you got to be also quite clear on sort of your vision and mission in the first place, so you can sell it
Absolutely.
to others, right? Interesting. Another question is, what strategies have you seen work best for keeping, let's say, high value clients during sort of scale phase or growth phase? Because a lot of times you have to kind of restructure your business a little bit, but then you also need to be on top of the accounts.
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. And yeah, it becomes more daunting actually, because people think, oh, it's, when you're much bigger, you're more insulated to the problems. But usually the process of becoming bigger means that you have bigger clients, and therefore the impact of losing a client becomes much greater, because it means multiple people and, all that kind of stuff. So it can be very painful structurally. And, I've always been a big believer in the idea that if you're not selling to somebody, they're one step closer to the door. And I
Mm,
think that really kind of talks to what we've just been, discussing really, which is around this kind of concept of, you've got to be that consultative problem solving partner.
mm,
Because if you're not doing that, if you're just delivering what they ask you to deliver, they're not getting the value from you,
mm,
strategically. But if you're coming in, turning around and going, well, you probably should be thinking about doing this. Have you seen the latest thing that X, Y, and Z competitors been doing, and that's created some, they've stolen market share. Why are you not doing demand gen properly? You should have
mm,
better Martech stack in house. Whatever it is, you need to be looking holistically at the challenge that they're facing and bringing them solutions on a fairly consistent basis. So if you do that, you become more valuable. If you become more valuable, you've got more tentacles into the
mm.
organization. It becomes more difficult to extract you.
Yeah, it's actually something that I've been observing and seeing as a trend over the past maybe year or so, obviously on LinkedIn. And we also, sometimes we have this conversation with clients about their positioning as a strategic advisor, strategic partner for the business. Because like essentially, you want to become, I wouldn't say indispensable, but sort of semi-indispensable for the clients they work with. And I also started seeing it across smaller agencies, like anyone maybe below 1 million in revenue. They're also trying to figure out how to do it better, and maybe design the sort of entire client journey where they embed them as a partner. Do you think that the agency model will eventually shift somehow? Considering AI and considering that there's more strategy that is needed, like the value add comes from the peripheral thinking and solving problems.
Yeah, it does, and I think that's a really
Mm,
interesting question. And I
mm,
think if I knew the answer to that question,
mm,
I'd be a very rich person, because we it's on the it's a boardroom level conversation, isn't it? At the moment, it's like what impact is AI going to have on this, and what does it mean for our future business plan? Right? Everybody's asking that question, and I truly believe that if you go back to first principles, you've got to add value, right? And that, so therefore it really increases the importance of that consultative approach, and that the ability to not just like serve, but actually to think. And I think that is where increasingly I'm seeing, if I look at from an observational perspective, at the businesses that have done well over the last couple of years, which quite frankly has not been the easiest 2 years in a long time. It has been those businesses that have very much been on the front foot around that, and I think that will continue. So if you're in the business of serving a
mm,
specific channel or whatever, I think you're going to always find it tough. But if you
Yeah.
can find enough people and gather them around your vision that are capable of, like leading from a consultative perspective, then I think you're in a really good place.
Uh, Interesting. Definitely, I agree with that. And then when it comes to perhaps operations and operational challenges at that scale, what have you seen doesn't work? What are the challenges agency face beyond 5, maybe even 10 million in revenue? How is it different to smaller scale? I would say, what things that maybe have you experienced personally, as a part of your experience running and building an agency, but also what challenges that are so apparent that for the fact that if agencies can pay a little bit closer attention, they can easily maybe overcome them or prevent these problems from happening.
Yeah, and that's from an
Mm.
operational perspective.
Yeah, from operational perspective, anything from structuring org charts to designing systems, workflows, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I come across this,
Mm.
on a regular basis through, kind of client interaction, and a lot of the challenges at that earlier stage come from kind of inconsistency of approach often. So, actually structuring, and again, it's back to the specialism thing, isn't it? Is to really start to specialize operations first and foremost, to have somebody specifically sat on that, because early on that's not always the case. And then making sure that you have a really consistent planning process that's delivered by people in operation. So a good example of that conversation I've been having recently is what with an agency business that has established that operations function, but what they hadn't done is create a consistency in task planning. So as a result of that, several people were allowed to create tasks, simple thing, but to create tasks in their project management system. That created inconsistency, which created problems with delivery, missed things, misunderstanding. So, like keeping it simple and stripping it back to, like, right, the planning system
Mm.
works like this, and that's run by operations, and only operations can add tasks, and all of that kind of good stuff. That it's the 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 approach of building complexity into the business, because that's what generally naturally happens as you grow, but then having the foresight and the knowledge and experience to be able to strip that back to simple. So,
Mm.
like, that's the general process that you should go through when you're thinking about scaling. Is if you firstly you add complexity to something, don't you, because you need to make sure that there is consistency. But then the problem
Mm.
is that the more different things there are in the machine to go wrong, the more things will go wrong. So
Yeah.
stripping it back and doing simple things like that is a really good example of, kind of getting ahead of the problems that will come as you add more and more work into the machine. So I think that's a really good example at that kind of earlier phase. And then from a structuring perspective, I think it is that process of like specializing and like pushing all delivery people into operations, and operations manage that and critically have responsibility, accountability, and leadership over delivery teams in that, that kind of middle section, at least before you get really good, heads of delivery teams in
Mm.
place. Making sure that everything's run through ops is always a good place to go.
Yeah, I see that the most common mistake is when agency, senior leadership starts to just throw bodies at some of the problems on the operation side of things. And obviously there are a myriad of consultants around the operations subjects. We do that too. But why do you think there's a tendency to think that the solution to everything is just hiring more people? I'm trying to wrap my head around sometimes, and sitting down. It's like the most irrational thing to do in most cases, but I think maybe I don't know, there's an urgency to solve a problem, and the reaction, the reactive move is to just throw bodies.
Yeah, and I think that often comes again. And the
Yeah,
important thing is, like actually having really good ops BI, right? So
yeah,
understanding capacity and understanding utilization to begin with, and then obviously, further down the line, understanding things like profitability by department and by client and all those kind of things. But having a project management, system, bit of software in place that allows you to understand that, all starts with good quality time tracking, of course,
mm,
is really important, because it then gives you the insight around things like that. Because without it, or when the data isn't good, that is your natural response. It's like, well, we need more people. When actually, to your exact point, you're absolutely right. you're only pouring more fuel on the fire, aren't you? So I can see why it happens, because people have never been there before. And I think, like my advice is always, right, okay, first and foremost, where's the data? What is that telling us? Because between good financial data, you can take and should be taking your view always on, like salary and related costs as a percentage of revenue, and making sure that that falls in the sweet spot, sort of 50 to 60% kind of area. That's one measure that tells you about, have you got enough people or not. And then the other measure is obviously what comes out of the operational machine as well, through
Mm.
time tracking. And between those two things, you can then figure out, well, okay, our cost of people is too high for the amount of revenue we've got at the moment. Why is that? Oh, okay, well, that's probably because we've got, too many, or too much inefficiency in the team, or there's some over delivery happening somewhere, or, you know what I mean?
Mm.
Those initial kind of simple metrics can actually then be not the diagnostic, but the flag wave, really, I think, for the fact that there is something ongoing that we need to unpick on a deeper level. So I think it starts for me, and, towards the end of the, obviously, journey of our business, we were, large. We had a team of, financial people, and, the CFO and management accountants and stuff. So we were very good at plugging in financial data with really good ops data, and it
Mm.
made decision making really easy, actually, because it was objective. It's like, yeah, we have too many
Mm.
people in that team, or that client's not profitable, and then
Mm.
you can do something about it.
It's fascinating because this is exactly the kind of work that we do, and I think we naturally, I wouldn't say stumble across the importance of combining finances together with ops, but it was sort of a natural, like, we realized, oh, data is a huge part of that. Most agencies, don't pay attention to P&L. Most of the accountancy firms that they hire design, or they have a slightly different incentive is to help them minimize the tax or optimize the tax, right? Where on the finance side, it's important to say, for some agencies who optimize for profit or for cash cow, they want to maximize the profitability and understand how to build a lean team and so on and so forth. But a lot of times, they don't know how to use data. And when I think about it, what I try to compare agency space and, let's say, tech slash SaaS industry. For some reason or another, agencies industries is a much older industry than the tech industry. But somehow, I mean, not somehow, but it's logical. Yeah, in tech, you've got engineers, you've got smart people. And there's a different multiplier. It works differently, so people are incentivized to go fast. But you'd think that in agency industry, because it's been there for ages, you'd have people who are also smart and pay attention to data, especially because you've got people involved, and you scale through labor or labor arbitrage, and the progress happens in a very slow manner. Like, people aren't fast enough to. I don't know. Maybe it's just a human factor, but what I see is that in SaaS tech, it's natural to use data, whether it's
Yes.
ops or GTM. In the agency space, it's almost a newity. I'm not sure. What are your thoughts on that? And
Yeah, it's so true, because obviously I
yeah.
traverse both of those things, and I
uh,
think that's why I enjoy that doing exactly that, because I think there are some
uh,
really good learnings both ways, actually.
uh,
Because I think, as well as the use of data, and obviously in some respects it is easier in SaaS as well, because generally
uh,
speaking you're selling a product and not people,
hmm,
so it is easier to measure in a lot of ways. But interestingly, I think one of the really key takeaways that I've realized over the past few years is that, and the most surprising actually, is the fact that if you talk to a SaaS business, one of the first things, the most important things that they'll talk about to you is the product roadmap. So where are you, what's happening next? What are we building? They've got a really good cyclical process for getting feedback from existing customers into products, and, prioritizing that and working on it. That never happens in an agency business, and that is
hmm,
dumbfounding to me. Like, where, and like, particularly, like, going back to the AI point at the moment, I think it's never been more important to be always on your kind of service improvement, and, like, what are you launching next? And yet, very few people do it. So yeah, I think there are a lot of learnings from the world of SaaS. Like, don't get me wrong, there's still things that they don't get right as well, and like, they don't necessarily know how to hire people in the right order and how to
hmm,
structure themselves, so they can sometimes get really hot on hiring, so they can be really bad at that. Whereas like you don't need all these people, you just need to organize yourself better and then improve internal communication. Like a lot of that sort of side of stuff they're weaker at, but there's also a lot of things that they are better at, to your point, use of data and using that as feedback loops and go to market and service and product roadmap and that kind of stuff. So yeah,
Mm.
it's good to kind of cross pollinate those things, I think.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Moving to the topic of acquisition and M&A. At what stage should an agency seriously consider acquiring another business, so maybe to fuel their growth or to achieve other objectives, maybe entering new markets? Just an example that we talked about before the interview, about the agency, US-based agency trying to enter the European market and acquire another small agency. How do you identify when is the right time for that?
That's a very good question, and I think
Mm,
I think more on a macro level, I think it's a good
mm,
time in agency
mm,
because there is massive fragmentation. If you talk to private equity, which are the literally written the script on this thing, then they'll always look for fragmented markets where
mm,
there's opportunity as well for kind of multiple arbitrage. So tick and tick, and there's a lot of subscale businesses in it, right? So there is definitely opportunity to do that. But of course, what you've got to realize is you've got to go in eyes open because it can be disastrous if you get it wrong. And I think the mistake that people make sometimes is that they underestimate the amount of work that goes into integration.
mm,
So there's a lot of work in buying a business, and DD, if you're on the sell side, so if you're an agency selling, due diligence is the hardest thing you'll do. You think that running and building the business is hard. DD on top of that,
mm,
is has the capacity to kill you. Particularly if the other side is, wants to know your inside leg measurement and that kind of stuff, which is actually quite normal. Then, you cannot underestimate the amount of work that integration requires. And so you have to be in a point where your business runs without you, or there is somebody in the business that can own that relationship and not have to worry about doing anything within the existing core business. So because the core business can't go backwards, so it's got to run without usually CEO or whoever, COO or whoever it is that's coming in to own the integration plan. So you've got to
right.
have that capacity at a very senior level to be able to make it work, and often be able to do that in person wherever they are, right? Because you can only do that so much from behind a computer screen. So that's always my advice. But of course, it's a great lever to pull if you're looking to kind of particularly get across a kind of a key glass ceiling in revenue, for instance. So there's lots to think about, but that's
Mm,
always my advice: is be sure that you're ready for it.
mm. And what would you say to the agency owners who are looking to maybe exit at maybe 1 to 2 million in revenue, but at that level the multiplier maybe is not as good as 5, 10 plus, but they're maybe hesitant about scaling past 5 million or whatever 8 figures because of mental pressure and dealing with other challenges. So this I see these founders choosing a lifestyle or lifestyle preferences. Maybe they optimize for other goals, but those who may be hesitant but they want to explore what it looks like, what would you say to them when it comes to growth of building a high performance agency that can be sold for a much higher multiple than at 1 million or 2 million?
It's a very personal thing, that, and it's different for everybody. And I think the first piece of advice that you've always got to take on board is like it needs to be the reason for selling needs to be more than just it's hard. And because of course you need to figure out, well, like what happens next. So the pull of you wanting to do something else has got to be stronger than the push of the business being hard. That's
Mm,
really important. And then I think you've got to really sit down and actually write the numbers down a little bit, both from if we did this for another year and grew 20%, what difference does that make? Because, like you say, that's not only is that another 20% potentially on the bottom line, but that's also potentially another click or two on your multiple as well. So actually, if you do the maths, it's quite eye-openingly different in terms of the potential kind of number that you're seeing. And then, of course, and I can talk with, real life experience in this, that you've got to make sure that the number does what you want it to do. Because I think I see too many people going, well, if I can sell this now, I can get best part of 1 million up front, and then, the wind blows half the right way, I can get, another half a million, million quid, whatever it is on the other side. that's great. Well, one, the only money that you're ever guaranteed is what you get on day one. So you need to make sure that that is enough. And if it is only that, that is not going to get you very far.
Mm.
£1 million sounds like a lot of money when you've never seen £1 million before. Once you've seen £1 million, it's not a lot of money
Yeah.
because you're going to have to go and get another job, or you're going to
Yeah.
have to build an agency again.
Yeah.
So what is it that you're going to do next? Because
Yeah.
the other thing, as I discovered personally, right, is you've also got to have purpose. So you can't just wander off into the sunset and go on holiday all the time. That leaves you pretty miserable. You've got to have a reason to get up in the morning. So, you need to think really carefully about what happens next, I think.
I've seen an agency owner who sold his Amazon e-commerce agency to Media Monks, whatever, a few years ago on LinkedIn, making a post about the fact that he decided to retire, spend some time in the nature or on the beach doing whatever, working on here and there, and realized that coming back, realized it was a very lonely and unfulfilling period of his life. So he came back and started building business. Although I assume he didn't need to. He's quite well off after the sale, but he came back because he lacked exactly what you just spoke about. Overarching purpose. What am I doing with my life, kind of thing. So
Totally.
interesting. Yeah,
It's a passion thing for me, this
yeah,
subject, because I've been there. I'm a living
yeah,
embodiment of this subject matter, really, because I did that. I tried it, found it pretty miserable existence, not doing a
yeah.
lot, and it's why I doing what I do now, because I genuinely enjoy the process of helping people go along that journey themselves slightly less painfully.
Mm,
That to me is a really, really good reason to get out of bed in the morning. And I spend a lot of time in schools talking about what it takes and all that kind of stuff as well, and like, be eyes open to the realities of wanting to be an entrepreneur, because TikTok will tell you it's the best thing in the world. Like that sort of stuff makes me jump out of bed in the morning, because like, it feels
mm.
like you're making a bit of a difference.
Yeah, certainly impact is a big part of it. Now, going back to the acquisition topic, I know that you slightly mentioned about the sort of the key characteristics that agencies should look in for potential acquisition. But are they any particular targets, or maybe anything specific like client base, service offering, talent? For example, in a D2C, in the e-commerce space, roll-ups are quite common strategy. Or when the agency decides to acquire, let's say, paid media agency acquires a Klaviyo or email agency, and they try to create that syndicate of different services and stack it together, and then maybe exit to private equity, whatever. What are you looking for? What sort of, when you're advising clients, what you're telling them, what they need to be looking or paying attention to when it comes to targets, and if they want to acquire an agency.
Yeah, yeah. Again, it needs thorough
Mm,
thinking about, doesn't it? And it has to be strategy and vision led, doesn't it? So it goes back to, what is it that you want to build, and
mm,
how do you best get there? And some of that's going to be organic, and some of it's going to be inorganic. And sometimes you do hit a glass ceiling, and the way to unlock it is to go and find some extra revenue and a client base to sell into. But of course, what you really need to do is make sure that you are thinking very strategically about, okay, well, what do you do at the moment? What are your clients, back to like properly consultatively understanding what your clients need? How can we best serve that need? So, like, if you're an ecom SEO agency, for instance, and they're coming to you saying, well, we've got a real problem at the moment with CRO, or we've got a real problem with analytics or something, and you necessarily can't solve that. You've got two choices, don't you? You can build a team, or you can look for an opportunity to acquire that talent in. And then if you choose the latter, then it's about making sure. And I think the thing that you should, my advice is always to spend a lot of time on, is making sure that it does those things first and foremost. And there's real, 1+1=3 opportunity across client bases and logos, because yes, you're acquiring revenue, but what you're really acquiring is the opportunity to sell more to those logos. And then
mm,
also making sure critically that the culture is right. And that's not easy to do, and people don't spend enough time on that. I've been through, a couple of those kind of situations. We were acquired by Interpublic, obviously, spent time in there, and, we thought that, the cultures were really quite similar on the face of it. Everybody seemed nice, but actually the cultures were really quite different. And that was a hurdle that took some time to get over. So I
Mm,
think, truly spending time in that business as part of the DD process is really important. And, interviewing not just existing clients, but, existing people that work there, but people that
mm.
have worked there previously and left is also good.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's a. I've never thought about that actually. But then I assume it also comes with the pressure, right? When you're speaking with a seller, but you want to do as much DD as possible, but then you also want to put your best feet forward in terms of the deal structure and what you propose to the seller. Assuming they also have multiple interests coming in, and then how do you balance the time that you take to do due diligence and spend with the seller with perhaps the pressure and timelines that come with making a deal happen.
So sorry, so I'm understanding the question.
Mm.
So it's about really understanding like how you get the deal over the line.
Yeah, getting deal over the line, that not sort of not spending. I'm not sure if that is actually a big problem when you acquire agencies, but based on my experience, a lot of times what happens that the seller would have multiple interests and they'll try to get deal over the line for, let's say, highest valuation possible. But then as a buyer, obviously you want to put in the time and the effort to do as much research as possible to get to know the business, which takes time, right? But then a lot of times they use that against you as their leverage to perhaps speed up the process of getting deal over the line.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, what normally
Yeah,
happens through a
yeah,
process is that you'll sign an exclusive head. So
right.
you go through the process, right, of like multiple bids, whittling that down through a series of kind of interviews and conversations and some relatively light DD. But then you'll go into an exclusive, which will then say, right, that's an exclusive for 3 months, maybe six, but usually three. And that gives the kind of the incumbent, the lead kind of potential acquirer, the time to be able to really dive into your business. But of course, there is a pressure on both
Mm,
sides actually to kind of get that over the line, because you don't want to allow them 6 months really, unless you're a bigger business,
mm,
to have that all unto themselves. You want to kind of put the pressure on, and a key negotiation will be to keep that period of exclusivity as short as possible for the reasons that you've
right.
outlined and suggested, because it generally as well, it means deal momentum is a real thing. And
Mm,
I think the longer that DD goes on, the more likely is that there'll be reasons to not do it. People get cold feet. So actually,
mm,
for lots of reasons, keeping that period of exclusivity and working with a buyer that understands the requirement for this to happen or quickly or not is a really important thing. And there's a saying, isn't there? Never separate terms and price. And I think that's really
mm,
important. People can focus too much on price sometimes, but actually it's the terms behind those numbers that matter, whether that's the structuring, whether that's, the amount of DD that they want to do and when they want to complete. There's lots of different things to look at there.
what some of the creative deal structures that you've maybe seen that maybe maximized and minimized risk?
No, well, I mean, obviously, the obvious way of doing that, I mean, there are so many, right? But there's the obvious way of doing that is to, minimize as much as possible the upfront amount, right? And make the rest of it contingent either on time or performance. That's the classic kind of approach. But yeah, I mean, in terms of creativity, I mean, you spend any time with private equity, for instance, and it's mind blowing, like the ways they think about minimizing and de-risking as well. So I mean, that's a subject for days and days of conversation, really. But there is always a structure that will work. I think the key is making sure that both sides are completely aligned on, like why they're doing it and over what period of time and what the process is. I think the deal structure comes next. Does that make
Mm-hmm.
sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Interesting. Yeah, incentive alignment. Anything with regards to maximizing the valuation? Anything that you've seen that works well. What factors typically drive high valuations for agencies during the acquisition? I understand that part of it is negotiation, and then knowing what you're selling, and from a buyer perspective, knowing what you're buying, trying to understand what you're buying. But for those who try to, let's say, sell their agency, whether it's 1-2 million or maybe 5-10 million, what factors actually drive the valuation higher?
Yeah, I mean, this is a subject, that I'm looking at all the time. I mean, I'm currently kind of in the midst of sort of three different deals at the moment, and one on the buy side as well. So three on the sell side, one on the buy side, and I think what you come to learn, and particularly in the market as it is at the moment, is that that quality of earnings is really important. So I think buyers are really looking at the makeup of that number, not just the number. So, like how much of that is retained versus project, really important. The more retained revenue you've got, obviously, the more predictable it is, the easier it is to apply a higher multiple. Also, what is the concentration of that revenue? So, how much of that is stuck in one or two or three clients? The whole kind of thing about, never have more than 10% of your revenue in one client is still relevant today, probably more relevant than it's been for a little while because the market's a bit tighter. So, diversification of revenue, I think, across clients and across different service offerings is really helpful. And then quality of senior team, right? That's also important, and making sure that they're tied in and incentivized, and they're not going anywhere. That's also key, because when you're buying an agency business, what you're really buying, you're buying goodwill and people, aren't you? And so making sure that you have a really great bunch of people that can run this and that they're going to stick around is really important. So yeah, then of course, they can, there's lots of different metrics that they look around, making sure that, margin is in the right place. It's not too high, because that suggests that back office is underinvested, but it's not too low, but i.e. it's not run very well, all of those things. So yeah, my advice is always, if you're thinking about selling, a couple of years before you kind of reach that point, get in bed with somebody that knows what they're doing, because again, the difference, if you do the numbers, the difference of a couple of extra clicks on a multiple, for instance, it can make a huge difference to the overall number. So at a smaller level of agency, moving from a sort of a 4 times multiple to a 6 times multiple is not a huge amount of work, but you need to know what that work is, and of course the impact of that can be very significant in your pocket.
Love it. Going further and be speaking a little bit about 2025 and what agencies need to prepare for to be more strategic, to be more efficient, whether it's operations or particularly go to market. What are you advising your clients on when it comes to preparing for AI, go to market, the new way or a better way of how agencies operate or should operate to win bigger clients, more clients, or optimize for a more lean and efficient operations? So, what trends do you see? What and how obviously you go about advising clients on it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, because over
Mm,
the past few days, I mean, by the time this come out, it will be
mm,
probably on the scaled site, but I've kind of done a bit of a roundup of observational learnings, I think, from the last year. I think there are 18 of them, I think. And yeah, absolutely, the one of them is, go to market. I think those that are winning are increasingly specializing. That's really
mm,
important. There's a lot to learn again from the SaaS world on that, and I've done a lot of learning from them around, really ensuring that you understand ICP and really focusing down on that. And then I think obviously the part that AI plays in the business is also really key. It's, boardroom conversation in pretty much every business at the moment. I'm not sure that anybody truly knows what the answer is, other than stay close and, make sure that you have, kind of an innovation and perhaps product service roadmap process within the business that means that you're talking about it regularly, and you've got a process of learning and
mm,
integration and all that kind of stuff. I think that's going to be modus operandi for next year. And then I think it's, again, it's the value of lived experience, really. Is if you're serious about this, that I think too many people perhaps think or want weirdly, they kind of want the pain of having to kind of fall down the holes and pick themselves up and dust themselves down, and keep hitting the glass ceiling time and time again. But I think my own experience of that is that I didn't suffer quite as much as some people, because I had great advisors around me. One particular, and that really helped me unlock stuff, and we moved a lot faster because of it. So basically, there is a way, if you're serious about growth, look at investing in some lived experience, because it will undoubtedly moving faster. Sorry.
Yeah, totally. And I think I've personally been benefiting from not just advisors but coaches, consultants. For it's sometimes I wonder if there is another way. It's like you can only sort of stand on the shoulders of giants, as they say, and learn from people that are ahead of you, whether it's a few steps or they've maybe achieved a significant success, and you're just trying to understand an overall vision, or we want to understand the context of the industry they operate in a little bit better. And it's been always personally, it's been always beneficial to me, and I think this is how I've personally also grown. So I totally agree with you. This is the secret to I think this is the secret to fast growth or to efficient growth, whatever you call it, is to learn from others who've actually done it. So yeah, totally agree with
I
that.
mean, that's it, isn't it? Like, none of us are reinventing the wheel.
Yeah,
It's all been done before, hasn't it?
yeah,
Ultimately, and I've always lent into that a lot, and I've always found myself kind of talking to older generation, whether that's just for pure life experience and interesting conversation and stories,
yeah,
right? And I think it's true of all the parts of your life, actually, that there's somebody that's been through it before. So I think that's always really helpful. But yeah, look, 2025 is going to be a slightly better year, I
yeah,
think, overall. I don't think it's going to be incredible in the UK. I think it'll be better in the US, but it'll be better, more consistent. Some decisions are going to be made, sales velocities will improve. So I think that those people that are in the right place and have got the right people and the processes and the positioning correct will grow next year. There's no doubt about that. I think M&A will increase. There's definitely a kind of a pent up demand there, both buy and sell side. So I think we're going to see quite a lot there. So yeah, I'm excited. It's going to be good.
mm. Yeah, me too. Me too. Yeah, we've actually been speaking about US as a potential market for ourselves, but it's a totally different. I've never been to the US in my life. Yeah, so I still need to visit as a tourist to see how it is there. But
Yeah,
because we've been exploring UAE Gulf region as a whole, because obviously the more and more agency founders end up moving to that region and establishing their agencies there. So we would like naturally started paying attention and working with agencies from there. But yeah, actually, you're not the first person who's telling me that the US is a pretty interesting market, and there's going to be accelerations, there's going to be growth, and naturally, I guess Americans are much better at executing faster than anyone else.
yeah,
So yeah.
yeah. Yeah, the culture's different, and like, don't underestimate the
Mm,
challenge of operating in the US. We had quite a lot of US business, and I've worked with a lot of people that have tried, to open, kind of US offices and stuff, and you have to sink a lot more money and time and effort in to actually establish a foothold than you think. Of course, when you do, the market's much bigger, but never underestimate the challenge is what would be my view on those things.
totally. Maybe that is for another conversation. But Simon, it's been a total pleasure. As always, I've learned quite a lot from it. And yeah, hope to see you soon again.
Yeah, awesome. Well, look, thanks for having us
Mm.
on again, Romans. It's been really, really fun.
Yeah, I'll put the links and to your LinkedIn and to your website as well in the description so people can find you.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks again.